What in the eugenics hell did I just watch? Hello, interwebs. I hope you are all doing well, because I am here to review the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. This one, Season 3, Episode 8, 4.5 Vulcans. And frankly, even saying the title of this episode makes me uncomfortable. I really do not know where to even start with discussing this episode. I think probably the best place is to mention that this is finally the episode where the clip that we were shown last year at San Diego Comic-Con comes from. And at the time that clip released, there was a backlash within the Trekkie community for concerns that clip showcased that the episode's very premise had at its core very biological essentialist and frankly racist ideals. And I myself even made a video expressing my concern about it. And to kind of give this short version, because it's going to be important for the rest of this video, the premise of the episode in that clip appeared to be, and does in fact seem to be the case once you've watched the actual episode, that 4 of our crew members, Pike, La'an, Chapel, and Uhura, take a serum to genetically get turned into Vulcans in order to pass on a planet as Vulcans. But then when they come back up to the ship, they are stuck as their Vulcan selves, and we get a whole episode with them stuck as being Vulcans. The problem with that is when they turned into Vulcans, they suddenly became instantly logical and also suddenly became racist towards Spock.
5 Vulcans should be more than enough down there.
4 1/2.
Spock is only half Vulcan, whereas the 4 of us
are fully Vulcan.
Is that not logical?
And just within that clip, the concerns were, A, Vulcans, we have learned throughout Star Trek history, are not innately incapable of emotion, and that logic is just part of their genetics. In fact, we have learned numerous times that Vulcans experience very heightened emotions, and that logic is something that they culturally, and that's important, culturally chose to adopt to help them handle their emotions through the teachings of the religious, philosophical leader Surak. But it was a cultural choice, and in fact, the Romulans were an offshoot of Vulcans who left because they did not wish to follow those teachings and wish to be more emotional and follow that line of thought. So to have our characters suddenly become instantaneously logical misunderstands that Vulcan logic is not part of their code and part of their DNA, and that has a very biological essentialist and racist undertones to it. Shift Vulcans to black people, for example, and say like, oh, if I made you black somehow, you'd automatically just love hip-hop already. Like that's just something that it's just innately part of your genetic code or whatever. And you'd see how obviously racist that is, let alone the fact of like, we'll make you black. That's already its own whole fucking thing. But Star Trek has always done weird alien face nonsense, so much so that Star Trek Lower Decks even made fun of it when Mariner became an Orion for an episode.
Honestly, this feels wrong. I mean, just please don't take any pictures of me.
So we'll move beyond that aspect of it. Like, that's not Strange New World's fault. That's a Star Trek problem. But then also them suddenly becoming racist against Spock is weird too, because they say that it's logical that they say, oh, you're just a half Vulcan, but that's not how logic works. Logic is a train of thought. Like, you can use logic to be racist. Vulcans only count if they are fully genetically Vulcan, therefore it is logical that Spock is a half Vulcan. That is a logical train of thought, but it is a train of thought that you would need to have certain assumptions based on, like, there is such a thing as a pure Vulcan. That is based in, like, genetic ideals. Like, again, it goes back to, like, the Aryan white race. Like, there is an Aryan pure white race, and anyone who's not that is lesser than, that sort of thing. So, like, that's already a racist train of thought. And it's weird for our characters to suddenly become racist against Spock because they weren't like that before they became Vulcan. So it's somehow saying that like racism is baked into Vulcan genetics, that they would suddenly view Spock in that way, because our characters before they got that didn't seem to view Spock in that way. Or it might even be subtly implying that they did view Spock that way and now it's just coming out. But I don't think that that's what the show wanted to imply, because that'd be even more fucked up, because it means our characters are just generally racist all the time against Spock. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not going that direction. So like all of that, just from that clip alone, really, really concerned people. And a lot of people at the time said to me, like, Jessie, you haven't seen the episode yet. Maybe they'll do better with it, or there'll be some explanation, or there'll be something going on that'll give a little bit more to this. And now, having watched the episode, what I can say is, nope. Not only is this episode just that bad, it is actually so much worse than I actually thought it was going to be. And before you get into it, I'll talk about it in the spoiler-filled section. There is an attempt, it seems, to cover for the problems here. There's one line in a captain's log that Una gives at one point, and I would bet you all the money in the world that line was added after the backlash at Comic-Con, because it's just a voiceover line, because nothing else in the text of the episode seems to follow that logic or showcase that what she says is true. So it's just for the episode trying to have some level of plausible deniability for the bullshit once they realized after the fact, after they had filmed it, like, oh no, maybe this is actually problematic. But like, but the rest of the episode, man, is just bad. There's so many things going on here beyond just the racist elements, which are really, really problematic, but they run so deep throughout the episode and come out in so many weird ways that it's going to take me a while to just go through them all, but it made me uncomfortable watching the episode. And then on top of that, so many of the problems that I've had throughout the season just become forefronted even more so, such as the relationship stuff. And this episode finally got me to understand why I don't like the relationship stuff in this show, because not only is that like the over heteronormativity, which I find is a problem, I've already talked about that elsewhere, but the fact that everyone here is like acting like teenagers, and we even add another character, Una, into this mix acting that way. I'll talk about that in spoilers, but like even Una is starting to act like a child, and everyone's acting like they're not adults. And you know, I'm fine with teen drama, but like it makes me think less of these characters who are full-grown adults acting like children. And I just don't understand why the writing is like this, because, like, you know, romantic plots aren't really my favorite, but Star Trek has had some in the past. We've had romance plots in other Star Trek shows. The only one that ever really, really worked for me was Sisko and Cassidy Yates. But we've had stories of, like, Odo and Kira and stuff like that. But they acted like adults in those situations. Or, you know, there was some reason for it. Like, Odo is kind of autistic coded and a changeling, so his weirdness around Kira is explained by, like, he's not used to dealing with humanoids and humanoid romance and all of that stuff. He doesn't understand it. And not to get too overly nostalgia goggles defensive, we have had some episodes of previous Star Trek shows have annoying teenage drama relationship nonsense as well, but it was also not good there either. The most obvious version of that being in the series finale of The Next Generation, where future Riker was still all pissy and jealous over the fact that Worf and Troy got together.
I think it's time to put it behind you.
I tried at Deanna's funeral. He wouldn't even talk with me.
Might have been tough for him then. He took her death pretty hard.
Oh, yeah? Well, he wasn't the only one.
I prefer my Rikers to be more like Riker in The Price, where he is like, I don't really care if Troy's getting some with someone else, I'm just happy she's getting some.
It's the first bad play I've seen you make. If you can bring happiness into Deanna's life, nothing would please me more. You know, you're really not such a bad sword, Rawl. Except you don't have any values, beyond the value of today's bid, that is. Deanna is just the woman to bring some meaning to your sorry existence, if you're smart enough to take it. I doubt that you are.
That's the kind of Riker that I like, and is a much more adult response. But here, like, these are full-ass grown adults, with maybe the exception of Uhura, acting like children, and it really, really frustrates me a ton. And this show just seems like it wants to be Star Trek Lower Decks so damn badly. Like, it wants to have the same fun that Star Trek Lower Decks had and have these weird, quirky episodes. But it doesn't understand how careful Lower Decks humor was. Because a lot of people just toss Lower Decks humor off as, oh, it's just nostalgic, making jokey jokes and just making a bunch of random references to Star Trek, and that's why it's funny. It's like, no, Lower Decks takes time to, like, use its humor in a very affirming way, in a very hopeful way. You know, I can give numerous examples, but, like, for example, one of them, there was an episode where Tendi goes to Deep Space Nine. She meets another Orion who is, like, acting up, being like an Orion's like, hey, this is just how Orions are. Aren't we? We're all like pirates, and he's part of Starfleet.
What's the first ship you ever stole, Ma? Actually, I don't do that stuff.
Oh, yeah. No. Me neither.
Look, not every Orion does the pirate criminal thing, okay?
Whoa, easy. I'm starting to feel some of those aggressive female pheromones firing off.
We don't all have those!
And then the episode ends on the reveal that, like, he was just acting that way because that's how people expect Orions to be. And he's sort of trying to live up to this, like, racialized ideal of an Orion because that's what's expected of him. And Tendi just says, no, be yourself. Be who you are.
They got adopted by humans, and everything I know about Orions I learned from the Hollow novels. I have bad ones, too. The ones with the boobs on the cover.
Why would you lie?
Well, people just expect Orions to act like that, so it's always worked for me. I never knew any other Orions back in Ohio, so no one ever checked me on it.
Yeah, I get that. It's hard when you feel like people expect you to act a certain way, but you just gotta be yourself. It doesn't matter what other people expect.
So, like, the episode is humorous and making fun of the same sort of, like, racial coding, but it's not saying, like, this character is inherently that way. It's actually pointing out structural prejudice and cultural prejudice against a character that Tendi is saying, no, push back against, be yourself in a very Star Trek-y way. This episode uses those same racialized jokes instead of says it's part of your core. It's part of how these people are. And it's frustrating, and I can tell how so much of it comes from the writers of the show having, like, a childhood nostalgic memory of Vulcans. Like, this show, so much of the show, especially the season, feels like the writers are writing Star Trek based off of their nostalgic memory of what the original series is. Like, they haven't watched it in 50 years. They're just remembering how an episode was from their childhood here. Like, for example, just to give one specific thing here, and I'll save the rest for spoilers, we get in this episode a moment where a Vulcan character says, like, I am physically incapable of lying as a Vulcan. And it's said as, like, verbatim, like, he literally physically cannot lie.
Seriously, I am very intrigued. As a full Vulcan, I really cannot lie.
But if you go back to the original series, and every time that has come up, because that has been a thing like, oh, Vulcans cannot lie, we have been shown numerous times that is not actually true, that Vulcans can lie. They just say that because it's part of, like, their cultural propaganda about themselves that they say to others and to themselves.
There's a well-known saying, or is it a myth, that Vulcans are incapable of lying.
It is no myth.
But we see numerous times Spock lying, even in the episode where that is mentioned, where Spock says Vulcans cannot lie. He does tend to mislead people.
I cannot allow the captain to be further destroyed. The strain of command has worn heavily upon him. He has not been himself for several weeks.
That's a lie!
As you can see, Captain Kirk is a highly sensitive and emotional person. I believe he has lost the capacity for rational decision.
Shut up, Spock!
Even in this episode, we have Spock lying for Una. And you may say, like, oh, well, Vulcans, he's half Vulcan, so maybe he's not full Vulcan and capable of lying. Again, that's biological essentialist bullshit. But, like, again, where that comes from, like, the idea of Vulcans cannot lie, comes from Spock. So Spock himself in the original series says he could not lie, so it should go, if you're basing it on that idea, Spock should also not be able to lie. But again, they just put it off as all Vulcans. Hell, the first time we meet the character of Tuvok, who is quote-unquote a full Vulcan, he's literally lying to Chakotay and pretending to be a Maquis as a spy for Starfleet. So Tuvok can lie, and so can Spock. That's literally why Chakotay was angry at him for a few episodes until the writers forgot midway through season 2.
You know, Tuvok, I may not get another chance to say this. Sometimes I find you arrogant and irritating. But you're a hell of an officer.
It's like this nostalgic memory of what the Star Trek stuff is without, like, actually remembering, like, the specifics of Star Trek. It's just this weird pastiche of Star Trek. And it disrespects this show's characters that I've come to love. And it makes them look like children and idiots and weirdly racist. And I want to be clear here, and then I'm going to get into spoilers on this episode because I'm just ranting at this point and I need to get into some specifics because there's so much to talk about. I feel so bad because I'm starting to come into every episode of this show negative. And I don't like being the person doing negative reviews online. Like, I don't like being that person. There's already so much of it. There's already so much directed at Star Trek specifically from, like, anti-woke people. So I don't like being the person that comes on here and just, you know, is negative. And I've liked this show before. Like, season 1 of Strange New Worlds, I adore. Season 2, there were episodes that I liked a lot. Like the trial episode and the Lower Decks crossover episodes, I really, really liked. They're some of my favorite episodes of modern Star Trek and Star Trek, period. This season, though, I don't know what happened. I legitimately do not know what happened between those seasons and here for this season to be the way it is. It's weird. and it bothers me because of how really kind of fucked up some of the messaging of this season is. And it also bothers me that so many people seem to give it a pass because they go, oh, well, it's just Star Trek. It made me cry because I remember the Enterprise, or, it made me think of Kirk, or like it's back to the good old structure of the Enterprise, the original series. And I'm like, that's just basing on nostalgia. That's empty. Like, what is this show saying beyond just Star Trek being a fun sci-fi show? It's vapid. And again, I said this last week. It allows Star Trek just to become nothing. And not only nothing, but send these really fucked up messages that both this week and last week kind of said. And, the rest of the season has just been like whatever nostalgic nonsense that I found problematic here and there, but ultimately was just like, all right, it's very traditional, boring. But these 2 episodes are just really problematic. And I'm not trying to be here like the leftists who can't have fun with anything. Like, the core message of these episodes is really fucked up, especially this one. And it bothers me. It legitimately bothers me. And I don't like to be that person. Because I feel like I'm just going to be, people in the comments are going to be like, you're the one who hates on the show. And it puts me in this weird position. I'm just going to be honest with you. Like, I'm trying to get work in Hollywood. I know some of these writers. Some of them have been very nice to me. Like, I know some of the people who have worked on Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And it makes me feel in a weird position to be like, not only, like, I'm willing to be critical. I'm willing to be critical of people who I've worked with. Like, that's fine. That's my job as a critic. But there is this weird thing where I now it's not just me being like, I didn't like the episode, here's my reasons why. I now have to be like, no, I found your episode very problematic. And I don't know how to say that. I mean, I know how to say it. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not going to try and couch it. But now it puts me in this weird position of like people that I want to work alongside and be colleagues with and who I'm friendly with. I have to be like, I find this really problematic, and I'm not going to do my job as a critic. That's my job, but it puts me in this weird position to the point of like, I don't know if I want to keep reviewing this show. Not just because I feel uncomfortable with the message of the show, but just professionally. So I'm just putting that out there just so you all know where this might come from. But there might be a place where I just stop reviewing this show. I'll probably finish out the season. We'll see what happens with next season if it changes or whatever. But it might just be that ends up being the case because it's just a weird position to be in. All right, let's get into this one. Like I said, I'm gonna be honest. I'm not gonna try and couch my words, and I'm not gonna try and do it out of anger or being mean. I'm just gonna try and explain my thoughts. So let's get into this. Full spoilers from here on out. Okay, so I've been sitting here for a couple minutes trying to figure out how I want to go through this episode. I think the best way is not to try and go through it linearly. I'm just going to generally talk about a bunch of different things that bug me, and I'll get into some specifics as we go. We get this whole situation where the crew has to go to a planet that the Vulcans contacted before the Federation was established, and they're a pre-warp civilization, that sort of thing. I always have a problem with the term pre-warp. That's a Star Trek generalized thing. It just assumes that there's a predetermined technological track that people go on. But this is already kind of a weird setup in the sense that, like, okay, so the Federation can't contact them because these people aren't aware of the Federation, but they are aware of Vulcans. So it kind of breaks down the whole logic of the Prime Directive, at least in this situation, in that, like, they know the Vulcans, so they know aliens exist. What does it matter that they would know other aliens exist and that there's this Federation? Like, there are answers to that, but it's just a weird thing. Whatever, I'm being nitpicky on that point. It's not the biggest deal. It's just to set up for a reason why our characters need to become quote-unquote full Vulcans. I already explained the racist implications of just the idea of how this functions. We do get a line from Una where she says, okay, the virus gave them Spock's cultural memories or something like that.
Because they derived the serum from Spock's perceived experiences, it has left our crew in a kind of logical state that normally takes Vulcans years to develop socially.
I think I said this in the spoiler-free section. I would bet money that line was added after the Comic-Con clip last year, because it's just a voiceover line. We don't see it in text, and so much of the rest of the episode still kind of goes on the assumption that, like, some of the wording and the way they talk seems to go on the assumption that, like, because they are full Vulcans genetically, they are like this way. Not, oh, I know this from some weird pseudoscientific, I got Spock's memories from, or like cultural learning from the genetic virus or whatever. It's a weird patch that the rest of the episode logically does not follow, and it kind of would help, but like the way the rest of this episode is worded is weird. Like, it would be, again, it would work fine if it was portrayed as we somehow learned the culture of Vulcans, and even then it would be kind of strange, but the rest of the episode doesn't follow that. Now, the reason it would be strange is, like, yes, they may learn the culture of Vulcans, but that doesn't mean there's like cultural history and things like that. And the way that I can best portray it is through this idea of, like, why are they always wearing the Vulcan uniforms throughout the entirety of this episode? Pike, Lon, Uhura, and Chapel wear the Vulcan outfits the entire episode. Not only is that weird, like, it makes sense when they go down to the planet, they're pretending to be Vulcans, they're trying to fit in on the planet, like, that makes sense. But when they come back and they rejoin the crew and they're stuck as Vulcans, why wouldn't they put back on their uniforms as Starfleet officers? Like, Starfleet should have a uniform code. I'm not one necessarily to be a stickler for that. I'm fine with Troy walking around in her onesie. That's fine. But it is weird that they're wearing Vulcan uniforms when they're not from Vulcan. They're not, these uniforms are not part of their culture, and it weirdly feels culturally appropriative. Like, yes, they are genetically Vulcans now. It would be like, God, I hate to keep making this comparison, but it, like, points out how this is, and we give it a pass because it's space sci-fi stuff, but it'd be like someone turning themselves Asian somehow magically, even that aside, and then, like, walking around in Chinese garb the rest of the time. Like, you didn't grow up in China. You didn't grow up in that culture. It's weird that you would just wear that even if you somehow could make yourself genetically Chinese, whatever the fuck that would mean. So, like, it's just weird that they do that. And so it's weird even if you do say, like, oh, we learned Spock's culture from the virus, because it's still being culturally appropriative of something that isn't yours. So, like, again, it's sort of coding this sort of thing as, like, oh, Vulcan culture is part of their DNA in some way. Another thing, too, is, like, when I first saw the clip at Comic-Con, I thought that the episode would at least probably be about, like, okay, maybe the character's being racist towards Spock. Like, oh, he's half of a Vulcan. But I thought this was going to be another, like, one of those episodes that's like a Spock learning episode, like Spock Amok or Charades. And that the episode would be about the characters learning that, like, Spock is not less of a Vulcan because he's half Vulcan. In fact, he may be even more of a Vulcan than they are, quote unquote, to however we want to qualify that, because he knows Vulcan culture more authentically and has a more tie to it. And Spock learns, like, hey, I may be half human, but I do have some ties to Vulcan culture. Like, I thought that was going to be the story. Like, maybe still has a biological essentialist base, but at least is sort of affirming Spock's, unique identity as a biracial person. Nope, that's not the case. It's just a jokey joke the entire episode of, like, yeah, Spock, you're half a Vulcan. Isn't that logical that you're half a Vulcan? Weirdly racist. I thought that was going to be the plot of the episode. It is not. So that's just strange. And it becomes a way for us to explore our different characters through a Vulcan lens. And they're all weird. They're all really, really fucking weird. Pike is probably the easiest one because it points out a couple other problems I've had with this character. So he's trying to be supportive of Batel, who is on medical leave and wants to get back to work and, can't be a captain because of her medical situation. I understand that to a degree. I want Batel to be a captain. It kind of annoys me, like, Batel's been sidelined as being a captain, like an equal in terms of that to Pike, and is just sort of relegated to being his infirm girlfriend most of the season. But whatever, I can understand it to a degree. But she wants to get back into legal stuff. Like, that makes sense. Okay, awesome. So we have this whole plot of, like, she wants to talk to her boss from last year, the asshole Vulcan guy who was in the trial episode with Una. Okay, fine setup. And we even have this somewhat comical thing of Pike setting up the room, being like, I can smell this stuff, like, whatever. It relies on this whole, like, a little bit, like, oh, human smell sort of racial stuff, but whatever. Again, we can toss that to weird sci-fi nonsense to a degree.
How do you think they'd feel about a visit?
Pajam is a place of quiet contemplation, Captain. I'm not certain we'd be welcome.
It's because Vulcans think we smell bad, isn't it?
Like, it's fine of, like, oh, Vulcans do physically have differences. And so, like, they would smell different. Like, that gets into sci-fi stuff of, like, okay, the air temperature is different for different species. Like, okay, I'm willing to roll with that stuff, and that can be some humor, and I'm okay with that. Where it becomes a problem is when they sit down to have dinner, and Pike just reams off all of Batel's medical information to her boss, clearly without her permission. And it's played as a joke. But, like, again, this is shown to be a characteristic of Pike before his transformation to a Vulcan. In episode 3 of the season, we saw him having some weird possessiveness over Batel's body and being like, oh, if I had known that you wanted this, drug that we went to the zombie planet for, I wouldn't have gotten it because I would have liked to know that permission. She knew that he would have wanted to have some level of say in her body, and he doesn't, like, that's not his call.
I just wish I'd had the opportunity to be able to say all the right things, to tell you I'd be there no matter what choice you made.
And that would have been nicer, but you know what? We both know you, and we know that you would have demanded we find another way.
And I think that's an interesting you can have that conversation. That's an interesting conversation to have about, like, partners sometimes feeling like they should have a say in your body when they don't, especially men. And, you know, the sort of, like, sense of, like, ownership there, like, that I still think would kind of exist within, you know, a Star Trek future of, like, that, you know, not saying that's, like, an overly problematic thing, but it is just a dynamic that exists in relationships sometimes. I think that's worth discussing, but the episode kind of glosses over it. Doesn't really deal with it. Just has one fight at the end between the two of them and kind of leaves it. And then here we have Pike doing the same thing of, like, just talking about Batel's body without her permission. And it's played as like, ha ha ha, look, it's funny, it's Vulcans. And she does say, no, he's wrong. But it is fucked up to, like, break her consent line, and we just play it as a ha 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 jokey joke. It's really across a line. And yes, Batel stands up about it, but it makes me deeply uncomfortable, and especially since we're just meant to laugh at it. So there's that. That's one thing. I do like at the end that she does get at least the promotion. Like, thank God she's going to be head of Starfleet law stuff like that. That's actually really cool. I'm glad she's going to be in a position to move up the ladder. Like, glad for that. I do like Batel as a character. I hate how she's been used this season, but, like, I'm glad to see her getting finally into a position where she is given some authority and weight. Like, cool. Love that. The next one we can kind of easily go through is Uhura and Beto. This one also kind of works to a degree for me in the sense that it is about, like, oh, we shouldn't necessarily change for our relationships, right? Like, oh, you should learn to, you can still have talks about, like, how best to navigate a relationship between two partners. You know, some people need to change for the other partner, but it's a conversation rather than trying to dictate how someone should be in that controlling way. And doing that through a Vulcan lens of, like, she literally, like, forced Vulcan mind melds Umberto to kind of brainwash him with his consent, which they at least point out, which I did at least appreciate. Though Umberto at the end says, you brainwashed me, which implies that he, like, wasn't okay with the level to which it was done.
Yeah, you said that, but you still brainwashed me.
Technically, you agreed to the brainwashing.
So that's weird. There's some consent issues in there. Like, Umberto says he's okay with it, but then is kind of uncomfortable with how far it went later. Like, you should have had a discussion within that. Like it's like within sex, for example. Let me use that as an example here of, like, you know, you can consent to sex, but then during sex, there can be things that you say no. And if a partner pushes past that, that's not okay. That's breaking consent lines. And that's kind of what Uhura did here. And again, that's a worthwhile conversation because there's stuff to, like, learn as adults how to navigate those conversations and how to figure out and deal with that when those things arise. But the episode kind of glosses over that. So that's kind of weird to me, but it's not hyper focused on, and at least, like, there's an level of, like, mentioning consent. So I'm like, all right, at least there's something here. And then the overall message of, like, you know, you should talk about how to navigate your differences as partners and where you're compatible, where you're not, and how, if you work together or not. So at least that metaphor kind of works. And Ortega's saying, like, if you don't love my brother for who he is, you're kind of an idiot.
You know, you may think that this Vulcan Uhura is smarter or whatever, but if she can't see what makes my brother great, then she's an idiot.
But then we get into Chapel. Chapel is weird as well because there's this implication that, and I'm going through these from, like, the least problematic to most problematic. We have not gotten to some of the worst stuff yet. But Chapel is very scientifically minded. And I don't necessarily hate this idea. Again, there's some level of, okay, Vulcans apparently are inherently better at science. There's, like, a few lines of that. Like as a full Vulcan, I am probably the best at science. I was probably the best before I became... Like, there's an implication that, like, being Vulcan makes you inherently better at science.
It seems it might be taxing for you to be doing so much work at the same time.
Not in the least. The Vulcan mind has fewer constraints and does not require rest. With the extra processing, there is far more that I can get done.
Which, again, not the case. A lot of Vulcans become scientists because science is a good train of thought in terms of, like, how you deal with logic. Like, that's why a lot of Vulcans get into science. But they're not inherently better at science just by the nature that of the fact that they're Vulcans. So again, there's, like, some weird biological essentialism there. But then she gets into this whole thing about efficiency. And again, that kind of works in the sense of a Vulcan thing about, like, you know, I see socializing as less efficient. I see sleeping as less efficient. And so I'm going into hyper efficiency mode and maximizing all of her time and cutting people all the way out. You know, I would have liked to see, like, there being some negative consequences for Chapel for that. If she had been willing to work with people, she would have been collaborative and seen something that she might not have seen if she was working alone or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, some level of consequence for her hyper efficiency, and actually saying, like, no, collaborating and being with people and socializing and talking and having conversations is actually a good thing. But it's just used to say, like, oh, she's just being hyper efficient and being kind of an asshole. And it comes across as just like, oh, Vulcans are just inherently assholes to everyone around them. Like, there's no lesson other than, like, I guess you're a dick if you're just being hyper efficient, and Vulcans are hyper efficient, so they're kind of inherently dicks. There's even a line from Spock where, like, Carol Kane says,
"And accept the fact that they're now permanently Vulcan jerks. No offense."
It is true. Vulcans can be jerks.
And, like, Spock says in a nice way, but, like, you get this implication that he's thinking about all the Vulcans who have been jerks to him, not only this ship, but throughout his life, who have been kind of racist against him because he's half Vulcan, which is a thing. We've seen that in numerous Star Trek things of, like, people being racist towards Spock because they view him as lesser as a half Vulcan.
It is truly remarkable, Spock, that you have achieved so much, despite your disadvantage.
If you would clarify, Minister, to what disadvantage are you referring?
Your human mother.
But that's, again, a cultural Vulcan thing, not an inherent in Vulcan DNA thing. But it implies that, like, Vulcans are inherently assholes, which is not the case. Again, it's a cultural thing, but there are Vulcans that we've met numerous times throughout Star Trek who are not inherent dicks. Hell, Sarek, Spock's father, is a dick to Spock, but he's an ambassador. Like, his job is to be friendly to people. like this idea that Vulcans are just inherent assholes is... It's again, it relies on this, like, nostalgic memory, I feel like, of Vulcans. Of, like, oh, I remember throughout Star Trek all these asshole Vulcan characters, like in Star Trek Enterprise, they were all kind of dicks.
To look beyond your provincial attitudes and your volatile nature.
Volatile? You have no idea how much I'm restraining myself from knocking you on your ass.
But, like, Vulcans, if you get into the nitty-gritty, aren't like that. And so this Chapel storyline is fine in terms of, like, oh, hyper efficiency makes you a dick, but it does in a weird biological essentialist way, and not a lesson of, like, the harm of hyper efficiency can cause. It actually weirdly implies that hyper efficiency can make you hyper efficient, when in reality, hyper efficiency can burn you out. So it's a weird storyline for me. It honestly feels like there's a missing scene in here because we never even see why Chapel decides to become human again. So, like, the emotional climax of the story just happens off screen weirdly. Actually, let's do Una first, because Lon is probably the worst one for me. So Una calls her boyfriend, Patton Oswalt, which I love Patton Oswalt. I'm glad to see him here. Him playing a Vulcan is kind of fun for Oswalt, because that's kind of against type for him. So I'm all fine with that, and does a great job with what he's given. And I on the surface, like this idea that, like, Una had a relationship that was so good, they were distracting to each other and just all over each other. Like, that actually kind of works for me just conceptually, but the way it plays out comes across as so childish, of Una lying and, like, forcing Spock into her lie, which again implies again that Spock, like, Vulcans can lie, but it just makes her look like a child. Why does everyone in the show act like a teenager? They're adults, and, like, there are ways to do this type of humor without it coming across as, like, soap opera childish drama. And again, I'm not against soap opera's childish drama when it's in a specific place. Like, I watch CW shows, I watch Buffy, I know the drama. It's not my favorite thing in the world, but there's a place for it. But these are, like, full-ass grown adults in this show acting like kids. And so, like, again, I'm not against it in its own place, but it's weird here, and it just makes me dislike these characters so much. And just this whole long sequence of, like, ha ha ha, they have kids and playing it up, and, like, she can't handle being near him. It's fine, whatever, it goes whatever. But the stuff that bugs me the most within this scene is the stuff that when Spock talks to Patton Oswalt afterwards, being like, him saying stuff again, like, physically as a Vulcan, I cannot lie.
Honestly, I am very intrigued. As a full Vulcan, I really cannot lie.
Again, that's bullshit and weird, just nostalgic remembrances of Star Trek. Like, Vulcans say that, but they can lie. We've seen that numerous times, and it's a cultural propaganda thing, not they are literally incapable of lying, because Vulcan logic is cultural, not genetically ingrained in them. So they can lie. So it's weird that he just states that outright, that he is physically incapable of lying. But the other thing he says, which is, I am always been fascinated by human culture.
What I would give to be half the human you are. All of my life, I have studied humans, your music, your culture, your savoir-faire. It is as the ancient humans once called it, very cool.
And that seems to be the resolution to Spock's story here, in the sense that we have someone praising his human half. And so it seems to come across as the story saying that Spock should feel less bad about only being quote-unquote half a Vulcan, because he should also appreciate that he's half a human. Which is fine, I guess. A storyline about Spock coming to appreciate his human heritage is absolutely okay, and has been done numerous times throughout Star Trek, including in this show last season.
I've spent my entire life so focused on finding my path as a Vulcan, I failed to see your journey.
But that resolution never addresses the fact that all of his friends were literally calling him half a Vulcan, as if he was somehow less of a Vulcan for being half human, half Vulcan. That's the actual thing that needs to be addressed, because Spock is not less of a Vulcan because he's half Vulcan. But we never come back to that. It's just, yeah, Spock should learn to appreciate his human heritage, which is not the problem that was set up. And the fact that they don't see that it's a problem is the problem. But on top of that, there's this implication, and I know that I'm reading a little bit too much into it, and the implication is like Vulcan culture is so boring and stagnant and dull and shitty, and humans have this such great panoply of culture. Excuse me, Diane Duane and DC Fontana would like to have a word with you, because Vulcan culture is incredibly rich. In fact, arguably, it is one of the richest cultures within the text of Star Trek. Human culture generally kind of comes as just homogenized Western American kind of culture with the Federation. We get some characters that have specific cultural touchstones, but for the most part, they're kind of very just Americanized, homogenized Federation culture that most humans exist within. Whereas Vulcan culture generally is shown to be very rich. And I mentioned Diane Duane. I'll bring this up. Diane Duane is the author of numerous Star Trek novels, Spock's World being one of her best, that go into this rich history of Vulcan text and culture and history, and gives so much thought to the way they think about logic, and the types of ways they think about different types of logic. It's really deep and impactful. But you can be like, okay, this is a book, Jessie. It's beta canon. Who gives a shit? That's not an actual Star Trek text. Throughout all of Star Trek itself, we've seen all these cultural rituals and ideas and art that Vulcans do throughout. And yes, it's kind of given this stiff upper lip logic sort of thing. But we've seen Vulcan statues. We've seen Vulcan history. We've seen Vulcan ceremonies. There's a rich cultural text here. He may have a preference for it, but it just comes across as yeah, Vulcan culture doesn't really exist because they're just all logical scientists, and him being interested in human culture, again, weirdly racist. The episode is being racist towards Vulcans. And also, the other thing that they do here is Patton Oswalt's Vulcan character is shown to be the one that is most closely associated with humans, in the sense that he's interested in humans. His name is literally human, Doug is his name, and there's this joke about oh, my family was fascinated with human culture, so they named us all of this.
Doug is an unusual name for a Vulcan.
My parents were drawn to human names. Perhaps you've come across my sister, Susan. She is an aide to the First Minister of Vulcan.
And so it gives this implication that all Vulcans are assholes unless they're more like humans. If you're more like humans, then you're fine. So it's this weird assimilatory logic of if you're less Vulcan and more human, we kind of like you better because you're less stodgy idiot assholes. And then you have a character who is a Vulcan who is there to justify that framing through the Doug character. Patton Oswalt's doing his best, and I like the idea, but the way it plays out just has all these racist undertones that deeply, deeply fucking bother me. But okay, this brings me to the one that pisses me off the most, which is La'an's storyline. When La'an changes, she suddenly becomes hyper suspicious, hyper aggressive, and being I want to capture more land, and I'm suspicious of everybody, and I want to be more aggressive.
I find it utterly fascinating that there is so much uncontested space out there. Space that is wasted. Space that is merely there for the taking.
And people keep pointing out, like, this is affecting her differently. Has she always been like this? Like, this is not like any Vulcans that I know.
I've worked with Vulcans, served under them. They're not super big on mutiny. Doesn't she seem a little extra manipulative? Oh, fuck or something.
Like, Vulcans can be different. How do you know that Vulcans can't be aggressive and weird and territorial? Like, totally the thing. In fact, we get a mention, and actually a scene that I liked. I thought this was a humorous scene where both Pike and La'an mention that they've both seen Romulans but can't say it because both of them have had episodes dealing with Romulans, but we're not supposed to know it at this point in the timeline, and they both had time travel stuff. So, like, liked that. Thought that was kind of funny that we acknowledged that. But they are in that scene acknowledging that, like, Romulans exist, and, like, both of them kind of act, like, especially La'an is acting a little bit differently, more like a Romulan. And my thought would be, like, they would say, oh, like, I thought where they were going with that mention in that storyline was to say, like, oh, she is being more emotional because Vulcans are actually more emotional. And Spock even says later on at one point, like, oh, Vulcans have a lot of emotions, we just have learned to push it down through logic. But again, we're not shown that as actually being the case. We're not shown that, like, Vulcan logic is cultural. It's shown to be, like, weirdly genetic through a lot of the ways that this episode portrays a lot of these things, despite the line that says, like, oh, Spock, they got Spock's, like, cultural learning somehow. So, like, that's not how the episode portrays a lot of these things. But I thought at least that that's where they were going with this mention of the Romulans, of like, okay, she's acting more like a Romulan, ergo Vulcan culture is the thing that's causing all these logical things, and La'an just doesn't handle that as well or is different about it. Sure, there's something didn't take in her getting Spock's, like, cultural stuff. Like, I thought there were going to be something to do with that. Nope. The reason she's acting so suspicious and aggressive is because she's an augment and she's just genetically programmed to be that way. She's genetically coded to be fucking evil? What the fuck? I don't... Again, it's going based on, like, nostalgic memory of, like, oh, Khan was like that. Khan was aggressive and territorial and thought he was better than everybody else. But, like, the reason Khan was that way was because he, yes, got genetically augmented, but because he was indoctrinated from birth to believe that he was better than everybody else, that because of these genetic shifts in him, he believed he was inherently better. But we've seen in other things, like in Star Trek with Bashir, he doesn't believe that he is inherently superior to everyone else. Yes, he has more skills, he has better memory, better reflexes, that sort of stuff, but he inherently does not view himself as better than anybody else.
Been letting me win, have you? What makes you think that?
The reason eugenics is bad is not necessarily like saying, like, oh, making yourself faster, whatever, stronger, better, whatever is inherently bad. Like, there's problems with that. But the reason is that usually when people get into genetics, what they are favoring is certain racialized features and codes and things that are seen as that are coded to be better based on the dominant cultural paradigm, which is usually rooted in white supremacy based on our colonial history. So, like, oh, with the Nazis, like loving blonde hair, blue eyes, that sort of stuff. But they would also, like, fetishize, black people for being like, oh, they're inherently stronger and faster. Like, the Nazis did that same thing at the Olympics. It's like these racialized coded features that, like, they associate, like, oh, black people are just inherently beasts of burden, so we'll racialize that. And, we're inherently smarter, so we'll value efficiency through eugenics. Like, these are cultural things that are valued through eugenics that like, you teach people to believe that they are superior. And that's why Khan is that way. But Bashir is not, because Bashir has been raised to not believe, he's been raised in the Federation, and he's been raised to not believe that he's inherently better than other people. Yes, there was some weird autism speak sort of stuff with his parents being like, oh, because you're not able to speak, we want to upgrade you. So there is, like, still some level of, like, anti-autism, neuro, like, divergent stuff going on in the Federation. So there is some, like, eugenicist ideals baked in the Federation that we see with Bashir's storyline. But Bashir as a person does not necessarily believe he is that way. And in fact, pushes against his parents, saying, you changed me to be this way when I was perfectly fine and should have been loved the way I was.
I stopped calling myself Jules when I was 15 and I'd found out what you'd done to me. I'm Julian! What difference does that make? It makes every difference! Because I'm different, can't you see? Jules Bashir died in that hospital because you couldn't live with the shame of having a son who didn't measure up!
So, like, That's kind of the whole point of that storyline. And even this show last season did a whole fucking episode about genetically augmented people, and saying they're being prejudiced against. That doesn't inherently make them see being better. Like Una was being put on trial, and she doesn't necessarily see herself as better. She's just different because of her cultural practices with genetic engineering. Her culture practices genetic engineering. So there's all of that stuff, and there's literally a line said to La'an in that episode that genetics does not equal destiny, and that scene was so good it made me cry when I reviewed it.
Genetics is not destiny, despite what you may have been taught. The fear you have of yourself, it's not your own. It was drilled into you. You were not born a monster. You were just born with the capacity for actions, good or ill, just like the rest of us.
It's such a good scene. And then we get to this fucking episode and we go, no, apparently genetics is destiny on some level because you're inherently evil. That's baked into your fucking genetic code, and Spock even fucking says it in this episode.
Being Vulcan affected you differently. You are aggressive, paranoid, suspicious, arrogant. I believe it is part of your core. You are part human but also part augment, a relative of Khan Noonien Singh.
I'm sorry, all the Vulcan stuff pisses me off, but that was the real tell to me of this episode, with it literally being like, oh, you're genetically engineered, you're inherently evil. And we even get a line from Chapel saying oh, you're two broken pieces. That Spock and La'an are two broken pieces.
And you and La'an are a far more logical match.
What does that mean?
Occasionally, two broken pieces fit together in the right way, like the ancient Earth practice of kintsugi.
It could have been so interesting if you did it that La'an just wanted to not experience any emotions anymore. Like, she wanted to stay a Vulcan because she didn't want to experience emotions because of the trauma that she experienced from the Gorn. And the story was that she needs to learn that dealing with emotions is good, and her experiences are what make her her. That her trauma is not something, she should have sought out, but it is a part of her now, and she needs to move forward with that. She can't just push it down. That would have been such a good storyline for using her suddenly becoming a logical Vulcan to tell with her character. But nope. It's literally, she's literally augmented DNA makes her genetically evil. I will say, and this has been across the board, the directing of this season has mostly been really, really solid. And that goes doubly for this episode, because the sequence where Spock tries to reach out to La'an and they do this whole dance, and it's shot with there's a spotlight on them and they switch locations as they dance. That was really, really good and surreal in a way that I liked. So hats off to the director of this episode. They did a fantastic job displaying this. But the nuance of how this scene is handled in terms of what the messaging is saying is so messed up that it really, really bothered me. They're just playing with Vulcans and not really understanding the difference between Vulcan culture and heritage, because Vulcans are a weird sci-fi alien species or whatever. And Augments are kind of the same way. I think they're relying on Khan was this way. So I guess, there's just some inherent DNA stuff about it. But it's the message of the episode is genetics equals destiny in some way. As a trans person, I find that particularly fucked up for obvious reasons. But also, it is the basis of so many problems in our culture today, the eugenicist ideals of so much of our culture that we're still dealing with, of men and women are inherently different, and black and white people are very different, all that pseudoscientific bullshit that still has a level of ingrainedness in our culture that this episode is playing in, simply because it has this nostalgic childhood memory for we want to play with Vulcans, we want to play with augments. I'm just fucking exasperated. Some other small things here. I'm just mentioning it. The weird thing of the Vulcan lawyer guy that Patel and Pike have dinner with, and Pike says, I learned that salt was evil, and the Vulcan lawyer guy saying oh yeah, if it's not natural in the food, it doesn't belong there, also has a weird genetics vibe to it.
If it is not found naturally within the food, it serves no purpose.
I didn't realize you could be racist against fucking food. And again, as a trans person, that's fucked up. And again, I get it that the episode's kind of trying to say that that's bad. But it still goes to this core weird biological essentialism nonsense throughout the episode. But saying shit oh, something that's not natural to something why is it there? As a trans person, who many people call me unnatural because of the way that I have transitioned, taking hormones and stuff, That's a fucked up thing to say. And again, the episode portrays it as bad, but it ties it all into the rest of its weird misunderstanding of biological essential that just made me uncomfortable. And it's also kind of strange considering that Pike is not naturally a Vulcan, so based on the same logic that he used to the food, he should have been upset that Pike was not naturally a Vulcan, so why is he a Vulcan? And also he's not bothered by the weird cultural appropriation of Pike using the Vulcan outfit. So all of that's just weird. One other thing that I did like throughout this episode, I did find it cute, Kirk and Scotty working together. It's clearly the show trying to build up their year one concept and Kirk and Scotty becoming the team that we know that they'll eventually be. That was cute and kind of fun. And the other element of this is like they have this whole plan to try to speak to their own Katras.
I believe what we're discussing is connecting to their Katras.
And again, this is just small stuff, but like the whole thing is, if we want to talk about mind body consciousness, like there's this whole philosophical discussion about like, who are we? Are we our mind? Do we have this internal sense of self? Are we our body? Are we how we act in the world? Is it some level of all of these things that make us who we are? So Star Trek being like there's this core sense of self is interesting, but they never really deal with it, and they never really deal with this whole thing of like mind-body separation, or is mind and body connected? They never really handle it that way, and it still goes down to like, okay, the Vulcan DNA made them this way. All that being said, I did like the fact that they acknowledged that if our characters decided that they wanted to stay Vulcan, they would accept it.
What if we did, and they still wanted to stay Vulcan? Then we honor that.
So that is some level of accepting their choice to transition, which is kind of nice. But then that gets into weird conversations of being transracial, which is its own other conversation. So, Jesus Christ. So that's just a weird, complicated, mixed metaphor that these writers do not seem to have the capability to untangle, because it's a very complicated subject, and unless they have a trans person in the room, they shouldn't broach that, because not only is it mixing in transraciality, but if we extended this metaphor to trans people in transition, Mbenga does say they're still, quote, human at their core.
They are still human at the core.
Yes, but it is a risky matter.
Which is very close to people saying they're still a biological male underneath everything that they say about trans women, or they're a biological woman underneath everything that they say to trans men. So I just want to stay away from that metaphor in this episode altogether. These writers want to grasp at talking about all of these complicated issues. Like they seem to want to try to say stuff with Star Trek, but they just don't seem to have the spoons or the nuance or the experience in the room to do so. And again, it's weird because previous seasons did seem to have that. Season 1, like to give an example, there's that really great scene with the non-binary character talking to Spock, and Spock wrestling with like, am I human? Am I Vulcan? Am I just half of each? And the non-binary character literally saying like, maybe you're neither. Maybe you're just you. We have all these expectations placed onto us.
Sometimes we act a certain way to fit people's expectations, but that's not necessarily who we are. And sometimes, like on the bridge just now, it can limit us.
You are proposing I better balance my human and Vulcan natures.
I'm saying maybe you're neither.
That is nonsensical. If I'm not human or Vulcan, what am I?
I mean, that's not my question to answer.
That's a great fucking scene. They do something similar in season 2 with Una, with this, the stuff that I already mentioned with La'an, of like genetics doesn't equal destiny. So like there are people there understanding the nuance. Episode 2 or 3 of season 1 had Una saying like, oh, Pike may just think like supports me, but does he just think I'm one of the good ones?
What if I hadn't saved all those lives? Would Captain feel the same? What would he do if I wasn't a hero? One of the good ones?
That's a very nuanced understanding of marginalized experiences. So I don't know what happened between seasons 1 and 2 to have those level of nuance in the room on some of these things to this season with an episode like this that just does not understand any of that stuff and fucks it up so goddamn hard in really problematic ways. I really just don't know what happened. is it just a bunch of writers left? Like, I know season 1 episode that I like so much, the non-binary one, was written by, I think, co-written by Bo DeMeo, who is the very problematic writer of the X-Men 97 show. I won't get into all the stuff with him, but it's weird. It's like, he's clearly a great writer, understands marginal experience, especially if you've seen the X-Men series, but then he himself is a deeply problematic. But, like, is it just that this season cut out all those writers? Is it just, the showrunners just forcing their own ideas on stuff in ways that they didn't before? I don't know, but it's really fucking weird. And this season is strange to me. And I see a lot of people out there being like, well, maybe they're just trying to not rock the boat because of the Skydance merger. But, like, these episodes were written, like, 2 years ago, before even the writer's strike or around the writer's strike and stuff like that. So, yeah, the merger was on the horizon, but it wasn't a done deal. So it's, like, weird that, like, 2 years later, this is coming out. And the fact that, like, and people even saying, like, oh, we're in a Trump's America right now, so maybe they're trying to account to that. But again, these were written a while ago. So, like, I just don't understand. It's just frustrating to me because I don't want to be this person to be negative, but, like, this episode I find to be really fucked up. And it, I'm not going to call you, I want to be careful in how I word this. I have a lot of friends who have been loving this season. And that's great. I am not here to yuck your yum. But a lot of the time when I talk to those people, what they say to me is, oh, I loved it because it reminded me of Kirk, or it gave me the chills of being like as a kid again watching TOS. And again, that is legitimately fine. I'm not necessarily against nostalgia, enjoying nostalgia. I do the same thing. Nostalgia can be a good thing. Like, when nostalgia is used to erase our ability to, when it makes something feel more empty, where it's just, you're just getting echoes of something from the past without actually adding more depth to it, it erases Star Trek being able to say something meaningful. And I don't think you're a bad person if you like this show, or this season, I should say, because I've liked this show in the past. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you like the show. If you're getting something from it and you're getting some nostalgic enjoyment, or you're just enjoying as fun escapist television right now, I understand that. We need a little bit of escapism right now. The world is tough, and I understand. But I see it so much, and this is not just in Star Trek, and I know I'm expressing a little bit further than this, but it kind of comes back to it. I see so much people being like, can I just have escapism, and not really wanting to wrestle with any of the implications of a lot of the things that are being done right now, and as a result, are just willing to give a pass to some things that are very problematic for other people, and also make the entertainment and the stories and things that we watch that we aren't willing to critically engage with. And as a result, it allows them to be taken for darker ends. And again, given the culture we're entering into, given everything going on with Skydance, seeing Star Trek be stripped of meaning and seeing these very problematic messages put into it that I think I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt, because I know some of these people. I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt in saying that they didn't intend this, but it is based upon either lazy writing or just nostalgic writing or whatever. I'm not thinking like these are bad people trying to say bad things. I think it is just them not thinking about the implications, and as a result, propping up some really problematic stuff. And seeing that and knowing where Star Trek could be taken makes me really scared and depressed, not only for my favorite franchise, but how the franchise has always just been kind of indicative of the larger cultural zeitgeist. And this is not a Star Trek problem. It's something I'm seeing across the board in politics and how we interact with each other. But Star Trek is a good touchstone for talking about these things. And just seeing it here just feels very weird and upsetting to me. And it makes me kind of out of my favorite franchise, which sucks. And I'm hoping it's just this show, that it's just Strange New Worlds. Hell, there's a part of me that's like, maybe season 4 will be better. Maybe the writer's strike just really made this a fucked up season. You know what I mean? Like, that's happened before where the writer's strikes have, led to rush seasons or whatever. So, like, maybe that's the case here. And I'm willing to give season 4 a shot. But, like, where we're at right now just saddens me. Especially after last week's episode, too. So, that's where I'm at on this. This is an episode that is, I think, one of the most racist episodes of Star Trek, and I say that knowing full aware that Code of Honor exists, but at least Code of Honor was overt in like, oh, this is about black people. And I'm not saying this is about black people, but it has a lot of those baked in assumptions. I feel like so many people are just going to give it a pass because this is about Vulcans rather than, species coded as black people, like that one episode from The Next Generation, which saddens me. Because again, it goes to that whole like people not willing to engage with a lot of what these things are saying. Because oh look, I just like my fun sci-fi Vulcans. Anyways, I'm repeating myself at this point. What did you think of this episode? Do you think I'm full of shit? Please, I'm happy if you think that's the case. Because maybe you see something in this that I don't. But this episode for me was just upsetting. So I love to hear all your thoughts down below. But beyond all of that, I hope you, my friends, live long and prosper.